Been driving all along, feel like I'm dreaming. Okay.
What's up, y'all? Welcome to Street Apologists Live. I'm your host, Vocab Malone. Thursday, October 13th, 5:38-ish or so here Pacific time. And I'm very glad to have you. This is the program where we serve the underserved and look into the overlooked. And I'm very glad today to have guest JP Holding. How you doing? And today we're streaming only on YouTube. There was a problem with the restream. Usually we hit up other platforms as well, but this is YouTube only. So let everyone know, make sure there's no Facebook and Twitter and all that. All right, JP, I know you from back in the day, but to those who may not know, tell people a little bit about yourself and your amazing website.
Oh, good heavens. This goes so far back now. I'm like at least 900 years old at this point.
Possible.
Yeah, it's possible. So I began on the internet in 1996 on the old AOL chat rooms and such. In 1998, I joined forces with a website called the Christian Apologetics Bookshelf, thereabouts. But he decided he didn't want to be online anymore, so he passed it all to me. I learned HTML by the seat of my pants, and I morphed that into the current website, Tecton Apologetics Ministries, which is tektonics.org. I always like to say, make sure you put .org, because if you put .com, you'll get a place that builds bridges, and they won't answer your questions about Jesus. So the website has been in existence since that time. So we're going on like 25 years now at this point that it's been up. And during that time, I've done a lot of different things, self-published a lot of ebooks, and I've written articles for the Christian Research Journal, for Hank Graff's organization, and I've written articles for creationist magazines. So been there and done that for quite a while.
You've also published a couple of physical books.
Yeah, self-published a couple of those. I have one on Mormonism, got one on the so-called idea that Jesus didn't exist, got one on the resurrection, got one on the New Testament. I've been all over the map and for the Kindle books, I've got one on Hitler, I've got one on conspiracy theories, got one on information management, and all, and they're just all over the spectrum in that entire time.
Yes, indeed. And I'm very glad to have you on today. Back in the day, we did a program on Zoroastrianism. That was on Backpack Radio. That was a while ago.
2012.
Yeah. Wow, you remember?
Well, I looked it up.
Wow, 2012. So we talked like 10 years ago.
10-year anniversary. Happy anniversary.
Wow, that's something else. Okay, wow. Okay, wow. I'm tripping off on that. Okay, so we're going to be talking about this book today, Let There Be Gaslight by Brady Goodwin Jr. And we've done a whole series earlier today. Adam and Alex did something on Alex's channel on ethics and morality, where Brady covers that. Now we're going to be in Chapter 11, Revisionist Prophecy, Part 2, Jesus and Paul. This stream is part of a multi-stream, multi-platform, multiple apologist-involved effort where we cover every single chapter. I mean, we even cover the table of contents and the title and the back cover. And so we have a few more to do, and I'm glad to have JP as a guest for this one. He's very qualified for this, because in this chapter, as JP you saw, Brady Goodwin quotes and seems to even endorse Richard Carrier. Can you please tell everyone, give a nice little intro so everyone understands who Richard Carrier is and what is a Christ myth theory? The floor is yours.
Okay, well, I can tell you Richard Carrier has been around almost as long as I have. I knew of him back in the day when he was just a small name on the infidels.org website. He was just writing articles for them, and he was a PhD student in history. And back in that long ago day, I actually debated him briefly live at a church in California. We had like a 2-round debate on New Testament reliability of the text. And it was such a short and limited debate that I just didn't feel like we could get that much done in the time we had. And so in the end, I declared it simply a win for both of us, because we simply got an opportunity to present our points of view. Oddly enough, he and I got along very well when we met in person, which was quite a surprise. It was very nice meeting him. But this was long before he got his PhD. It's long before he entered into all kinds of controversies that I understand he's in now. I just have not had any contact with him since that time, since we had that debate. But I know he's been through a lot of controversy within the atheist community. I've sort of kept up on it from a distance. But of course, as we know, he's basically considers himself sort of a traveling artist at this point, a traveling scholar / artist who writes a few books and does speaking engagements. It's a fascinating path.
Indeed. Christ myth theory. How would you how would you briefly describe it?
Well, it's we say Christ myth, but generally we do mean Jesus myth more specifically. And broadly speaking, it refers to the idea that Jesus never even existed at all as a person, let alone existed as the Son of God or as a divine being who walked the earth. This theory has been around for quite a long time in various forms, probably since the 17th and 18th century. There are two major forms of it. One is the idea that the New Testament, beyond the Gospels, does not say anything in detail about the life of Jesus, and therefore people like Paul, who wrote the New Testament epistles, did not believe in a historical Jesus, but believed that he was some sort of heavenly being who never came to earth. The other form of the Christ myth or Jesus myth theory is the pagan copycat theory, as it's popularly called. This was the idea that, again, Jesus never existed, but that the idea for Jesus and his life came from the lives of pagan deities such as Mithra or Dionysus or just dozens of others. They've even put some Japanese mythological beings into that mix. Sometimes those two ideas are combined. Sometimes the copycat idea is considered a bit of a fringe lunacy idea. It was part of what was called the Zeitgeist movie some time ago. And there was another author named Acaria S. who promoted that idea. Carrier, in particular, though, seems to incline more towards the other half of that thesis, the idea that there simply wasn't enough historical data in the New Testament. And one of the leading proponents of that theory was G.A. Wells for a time, and he wrote several books on it, although apparently he also changed his mind late in life. And then more recently, Earl Doherty was a chief proponent of that idea, that the details of the New Testament epistles support the idea of a heavenly Jesus rather than a historical Jesus.
Well, let's get into that, where this is utilized in Brady Goodwin Jr.'s book. And he was in ministry for 30 years and then lost his faith, and this book is the product of that. We're focusing on Chapter 11, Revisionist Prophecy, subtitled Jesus and Paul here in the print edition. I'm going to start with the first time he really gets into this. All right, listen to this. I'm going to read from page 243. Paul goes on to say that he did not confer with those who were apostles before him. He only met with Peter for 15 days and saw James, the brother of Jesus. So although Paul has written the first New Testament scriptures and the bulk of Christianity's core doctrines, he never physically met Jesus, and none of Paul's teachings come from any of the men who spent years walking with Jesus as his disciples. Instead, and here's the key part I want to focus on here, JP, instead, this new doctrine was divinely revealed to him alone, decades before anyone else ever thought to construct a life of Jesus account. Let that sink in. And then I want to read this other thing that goes on with that. If someone were to come to you claiming they had been given new designs for religion about a divine Christ man by a voice in the sky, how willing would you be to sign up? Yet that is essentially what Paul has done. Then decades later, others picked up the pen to compose stories about the life of that Christ man. Yet their stories reflect almost no knowledge of or similarities to Paul's revelation. How do we explain this? JP, what's going on there, man? What's happening in those two paragraphs?
That's how funny. I've highlighted that very paragraph here in my Kindle edition because it was highly symptomatic of his thinking on this story. I'm glad he doesn't Brady doesn't go the full length of the Christ myth doctrine and say that Jesus didn't exist, but he does seem to have fallen for one of the typical arguments of that. So let's talk about a couple of the flaws we have here. The first thing is that let's start with the basic about why we don't have any biographical details about Jesus in Paul's letters. Now, the Gospels, by their nature, are of a certain genre from the ancient world. They are ancient biographies. They were formatted after the format of ancient biographies, and those were specifically intended to relate the life details about people that were their subjects. So that's what their purpose was. On the other hand, what is Paul doing? Paul is not writing a biography of Jesus. Paul is writing problem-oriented epistles or letters of the time that address specific problems in the specific churches that he is writing to. So there's not any sort of controversy in Corinth saying, we don't believe that Jesus lived in Nazareth. We don't believe that Jesus died on a cross. That's all material that 20 years after Paul preached would have been taken for granted already. So he's not going to be going around mentioning these little historical details except in a very elusive fashion, which is what he does. We see occasional references to the cross or the crucifixion, where we see occasional allusions to words of Jesus, but we aren't going to see a full-fledged biography of Jesus because that's just not necessary, and it's not relevant to Paul's purpose in writing these letters. Now, so this brings us to his other points. First of all, he never physically met Jesus, and I'm like, so what? Now, if you want to go through and talk about some of these teachers that were very popular in the ancient world, Jewish teachers such as Hillel and Shammai, many people wrote about teachers such as them or about Socrates and had never met them. So there's no requirement that you have to physically meet a person in order to describe doctrines about that were concerned with their teachings. In fact, this is the sort of thing we might expect from someone who is like a second-generation teacher. Another consideration, Paul was a very intelligent rabbinic student, and he had had a background, as by his own reckoning, in some of the greatest thinking of Judaism. And that's what we find in most of his letters when he's explaining these doctrines. Now, we don't have time to go into a lot of detail on this, but you won't find a whole lot in Paul that does not have some sort of parallel in Jewish teaching otherwise. So he's really not being that novel in his approach. The only thing that's novel really is that he is applying Jesus into the mix rather than the general ideas of salvation and of faith and of loyalty to God and of the purpose of the law. So, and he's saying none of Paul's teachings come from any of the men who spent years walking with Jesus as his disciples. Well, a lot of Paul's teachings come from the Jewish background with only slight modifications that we might expect from having met for Christians like Peter and James and having learned about the teaching of Jesus and about the life of Jesus. So you can't really say anything like his doctrine was divinely revealed to him alone. The only thing that was divinely revealed to him alone was that Jesus was resurrected, and that was only a special appearance. He doesn't say anything about his full-fledged doctrines of salvation being revealed just to him. He doesn't say anything to that effect. He just refers to Jesus being revealed to him specially because he was a persecutor, and the whole idea was to turn him around, and so that the Christian movement would have, I believe, this is how I see it, that the Christian movement would have a teacher like Paul who was specially trained in Jewish scholarship. And this is something, let me take a diversion here. I happen to believe that there's sort of a balance of powers that was arranged in the early church. On the one hand, you have someone like Paul who's extremely intelligent and their best expositor of doctrine, but he had never met Jesus personally. Then you have people like Peter, who were disciples of Jesus, who walked with him, but who did not have the sort of grounding that Paul would have in order to explain doctrine. And then you had people like James, the brother of Jesus, who were related to Jesus, but they also did not believe in him until after his resurrection. And so each of them sort of had an advantage and each had a disadvantage. And so none of the three much like the three branches of government we have in America. None of the three could take superiority over the other. They each had something over the other. And so there was a certain balance there, I believe.
Right, yeah, and I think that helped in a lot of ways with early Christianity, that balance. No doubt, no doubt, no doubt. Now, let's continue on here, because right after he says that, JP, this thing about Paul, the claims about Paul, he immediately brings in Richard Carrier. So we're at 243. I read 2 paragraphs in a row. Now I'm going to read page 244, and here's where Carrier comes in for the first time from the pen of Brady. Historian and atheist Richard Carrier observes that Paul writes about Jesus in highly theological and mythological ways. Notice he says observes instead of claims or something like that, or even writes. Observes, as if it's a fact that Carrier is observing. See? Carrier points out that much of what Paul says of Christ was also said about other humans and demigods within the mystery cult religions of the Greco-Roman world. I'm going to stop there, and then we're actually going to get into our first example. So don't jump on our first example yet right here. But that's this. It's almost like, hey, everybody had their myth thing, and the Jews wanted in, so they had their myth thing, and it ended up being this Jesus guy, cut from the same cloth, but some Old Testament thrown in there, and that's what's going on. So, I mean, it's strange to me that Brady, smart guy, went to Westminster, all that. He doesn't leave Christianity and then go to John Dominic Crossan or Bart Ehrman even. He goes immediately to Richard Carrier as his Gospels guy. That's like you never smoked a cigarette and you immediately start with crack. It's like, whoa, where was all the where was the in between stages here? That's what it feels like to me, honestly. Carrier, and look what Carrier says. JP, I know we could do a whole show on that sentence or two, but what's wrong with it?
Well, it's, as you say, there's so many other people he could have gone to as a source. I mean, he even, in other places, he quotes N.T. Wright, and he's clearly familiar with at least one of his works. I can't say for sure that he's familiar with all of them. And certainly if he went to Westminster, he had libraries full of books by scholars who were much more qualified than Carrier to address these particular issues. And my only thought is that he must simply have chosen to select Carrier because that's the ideology he wants to present. That's just simply the thing. That's Carrier simply said things the way he wanted to say them, the best way he wanted to say them. That's all I can think, because I certainly don't see that. Carrier certainly has not matched up with N.T. Wright, for example.
Yeah, it's a strange combination, right?
Very strange. Sort of like a. It's not like the chocolate and peanut butter thing. It's more like chocolate and habanero peppers.
Yeah, it actually reminds me of one of the insults that the Athenians gave to Paul. This guy seems to be a seed picker. There's an indication there that they were claiming Paul mismatch. It's almost like that's what's going on with his choice of scholarship.
Yeah, now when someone first wrote to me about this book and asked me to read it, that was my initial impression. In fact, I think I used that very verse that you referred to, the seed picker verse.
Oh, really? That's funny.
Yeah, because he has such a strange mix of sources in here. Yeah. And while that obviously doesn't guarantee that that's all he's ever read, I really get the feeling that that is all he's read. Or if it isn't all he's read, that he's deliberately hiding other things that he's read in order to try and promote a certain point of view.
Yeah, I bet some Christ mythicist is like, oh, look, seed picker. That proves Paul was ripping off things from different places. You just gave the facts right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, the main Carrier book he quotes is literally called Jesus from Outer Space. Now here's the next line or two from Brady Goodwin. Here's what he says. And this is right after I'm gonna reread one part though, so it sets it up here. Listen to this, everyone. This is Brady Goodwin Jr., founding member of the Cross Movement. Listen to what he says here. Carrier points out that much of what Paul says of Christ was also said about other humans and demigods within the mystery cult religions of the Greco-Roman world. For instance, the Greco-Roman god Dionysus, also known as Bacchus, was born of a virgin, and his blood was wine to be shared in the Eucharist observed by his worshippers. This myth was already known 500 years before the life of Jesus Christ. Now, you've actually got a little section on Dionysus in here. So what do we want to say about Dionysus, JP?
Oh, yeah, say a lot. Well, first of all, I've got to tell you something that's so hilarious because, I have a YouTube channel too, Tecton TV, and most of the videos on it are my basic animation videos. But there are two that are live and in-person videos where I acted in person. And in one of those, I played the role of Dionysus. And I think you'd really enjoy it. I don't know if you've seen it
I've
yet
seen
or
it.
not,
Yeah, I
but
remember your
yes.
animation videos. You animated them, right?
Yeah, basically, with a
Yeah.
very primitive animation. I mean, we're talking Speed Racer of the 60s animation, but
But I remember you acted in a few of them too.
just a couple. And one of them was on Dionysus, and I decided to put Dionysus in the persona of like a professional wrestler kind of thing, where he was coming on and saying that, hey, you think Jesus did this stuff? Well, I did it first, long time ago. Yeah, man. Yeah, no, I can still sound like that. In fact,
You're
I
getting
seem to-
close. I can hear it coming out.
Yeah, I seem to sound better. And in the end, Dionysus repented and changed from being the god of wine to being the god of energy and sports drinks. So that's a good change.
Sounds like something in Idiocracy. By the way, shout out to our first super chat of the night. Pitar Milic says, I know this is off topic, but how's this for a Boom Boom Room episode? It was the voice that reminded me of the Boom Boom Room thing JP just did. Muhammad meets H.P. Lovecraft. There are actually a lot of similarities there. Well, I'll run it by David. The next one coming out, I can tell you, is Apostate Prophet playing the role of Sigmund Freud meeting Muhammad. I'll tell you that. But thank you for the super chat. All right, I'm going to maybe JP, we can even play this Dionysus video at the end of the program once you jump off here. I might play it so people can see it.
That would be great.
So isn't Jesus like kind of like Dionysus? Why not?
The born of a virgin thing. So, yeah, this is where we get into the stuff I have in the book. And I've got a lot of details on that. I even enlisted the help of a classical scholar I knew at the time who lived in England. There's no story that matches up with this idea of born of a virgin, unless you really want to really twist around what a virgin means. In one particular story, his mother was impregnated by Zeus when Zeus decided to pull one of his usual tricks and take the form of a lightning bolt. Now, I wouldn't call that, you might call that a virgin birth in a sense, but you see, what they miss is what we're really talking about with Jesus is virginal conception,
Right.
not virginal birth per se. I mean, we're talking about something where there was no divine seed, shall we say,
Right.
which is what we have in the case of Zeus. And of course, we know Zeus had ways of leaving divine seed just about every way you might imagine.
Yeah, he left a lot of divine seed among the
Yeah.
pantheon there.
Yeah, I mean, if he were around today, he'd probably be using DoorDash to deliver divine seed, for all we know. But
That's a super gross analogy, but
Yeah, well.
or storms apparently, thunder and lightning storms. But yeah,
Just
this is something that Zeus definitely did. Not like the God of the Bible, by the way, everyone. Hopefully, you're getting that.
no, and the illusion Luke in particular makes when he describes the conception of Jesus, he uses the same language found in Genesis that refers to the Spirit overshadowing the waters, which would have been understood more in terms of a act of divine fiat, not some kind of divine seed that was placed inside Mary.
Right.
So I never found, neither I nor the scholar that I had in my consult at the time knew anything about any sort of virgin conception for Dionysus, and I never found any reference to it in any scholarly work about Dionysus by any relevant scholar. So that brings us then to the second part, which is I think Brady got something confused here. He described what he said. He said his blood was wine to be shared in the Eucharist observed by his worshippers. That's not anywhere that I've found. I mean, there are a couple of ideas that Dionysus had done the water to wine miracle. There are some ideas that he did have sort of a Eucharistic meal of some kind. That in itself would mean very little because all religious groups of the time had some sort of what they call a fellowship meal, because that's just what people did when they got together. Everyone had some sort of meal when they got together. I mean, even firemen's clubs of the time had some sort of meal, communal meal. And even today after church, we all go to Golden Corral. That's basically the same thing that they were doing when they had the Lord's Supper. In fact, many churches today, such as one I attend, which is mainly people by Indonesian immigrants, they bring a whole meal for you to have after church. So this is not anything special, to have maybe a meal like that. But there's certainly nothing about the blood his blood being wine shared in the Eucharist that I can recall.
Yeah, and it's messed up that he calls it the Eucharist, and that's not even in quotes. Born of a virgin is in quotes, but blood was wine is not. And you know what the thing is? The only source here that he gives, Richard Carrier.
Yeah, the only one.
So, I mean, Brady, again, I know is a smart guy, but he has to know it's unacceptable to tell us this about a God that he's saying was known in these ways 500 years before Christ, and then gives no primary source or even someone that's really trusted in the field. I mean, if you know the story of how Carrier kind of first went with the Christ myth theory, I mean, there's definitely conflict of interest, to say the least. And this is not good to make that their only quotation is literally a book called Jesus from Outer Space. But that's what he does. So we're supposed to take Carrier's word. Brady Goodwin is telling people in this book, don't trust Jesus. Don't trust the God of the Bible. Don't trust the scriptures. Trust Richard Carrier.
Well, I'd like to have seen him turn in a paper at Westminster with Richard Carrier as his only source. It's
Richard Carrier and N.T. Wright, don't forget.
Oh, well, yeah.
Oh, and don't forget, he also quotes Joshua Bowen's The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament in this chapter.
Well, he's only missing then Ken's Guide to the Bible, I suppose, and he'll be all right. Yeah,
my goodness. So look at this. Continuing on here. Watch this. And he's literally just paraphrasing Carrier here, as if that's... it's mind-blowing. Watch this. Page 244. On top of that, says Carrier, Paul hardly ever places the Lord on earth until after his resurrection. These details cause him to wonder if Jesus was a historical person for Paul. So let me just stop here. I'm gonna let JP respond. Again, JP Holding, so glad to have him on today's show. Author of the Shattering the Christ Myth, specializes in this. I mean, back in the day when I looked up Christ Myth stuff when I was in community college, JP's work was like the primary place, and he would always point you to a primary source or a reputable scholar in the area. He's sort of a bibliologist of sorts. I always viewed JP's work because he would have such a great bibliography and really knew where to turn. So I'm very glad he's on here today. Definitely subscribe to his YouTube channel. Nate, thank you for dropping that in the live chat. But let me just stop here again. This is Brady Goodwin now, pointing everyone to Richard Carrier. And Brady Goodwin, who's most famously known for a hip-hop song called Who's the Man, about how grand Christ is, that he's more than just a man. And he was so successful, they did another updated version on another album later, which is hard for me to believe actually was even better than the first one. He went from that to a place where he's quoting Richard Carrier and saying, this causes Richard Carrier to wonder if Jesus even existed. So he's putting it on Carrier, but notice this is the alternative position to a historical Jesus that he's putting forth for us. It's like, bro. And then he's asking us to implicitly trust Carrier. Everyone let that sink in. Now, let me read this again, and JP's going to comment. On top of that, says Carrier, Paul hardly ever places the Lord on earth until after his resurrection. These details cause him to wonder if Jesus was a historical person for Paul, or instead, do the epistles represent a Jewish version of what many other cultures were doing at that time, i.e., finding ways to synchronize Greco-Roman myths with one's own religion and culture. Perhaps this sounds like an updated version of what we have already said about the Old Testament. It should. Carrier sums it up well. This is Carrier now. This is a block quote by Carrier I'm about to read here, and then JP jump on. This is just as happened the last time the Jews were subject to a great empire. When under Persian rule, they adopted Persian Zoroastrianism, ideas of an apocalypse, a messiah, a linear view of history, resurrection of the dead, and Satan as enemy of God and creator of death. All converted into a Jewish form, surrounded and altered by Jewish ideas, of course, end quote. By the way, Nate, can you find the Zoroastrian show that we did on the channel with JP, and drop that link in there? Because we actually have a whole show on Zoroastrianism, and listen to that. 10 years ago we did. But JP, what do you want to do with this, bruh?
Well, I want Weird Al Yankovic to write another version of that song you talked about. That would be the first thing we need to do.
Which
Uh,
song? Which song?
the one that Brady did, and you talking about? Apparently,
Oh, right. Who's the man? Right.
yeah, Weird Al apparently needs to do a version of that
A
now.
Christmas version. Where's the
Yeah,
man?
I might have to write it and sing it. No, you don't want me to sing it. Okay, so let's begin with the first part there, where he says, Paul hardly ever places the Lord on earth until after his resurrection. Okay, Carrier was not the first to do this, so we can just erase his name from consideration here. Earl Doherty did it before him, and then even before Doherty, G.A. Wells, not H.G. Wells, for heaven's sake, G.A. Wells did it before that. And again, this is that basic idea that the New Testament epistles don't mention anything about the life of Jesus. And so their idea is that maybe they don't think Jesus actually lived on earth. And it's amazing some of the contradictions that these people pull out. And in that book of mine, you pointed out, I list many problems with this. But let me just give one example. Okay, so Earl Doherty says, okay, yeah, so Paul says that Jesus was crucified. But he never names the location of the place where he was crucified. He never mentions Calvary. So therefore, he must have believed that Jesus was crucified somewhere in this nether heavens region, some sort of fake place up in the sky,
By the
and
moon, right? Isn't it by the
by
moon?
somewhere about 2 miles beside the moon, maybe just past the rest stop on the asteroid. I don't know, but here's the thing. Okay, Earl, if so, didn't this hill in heaven that Jesus was crucified on have a name? Didn't places in heaven have names too? But Paul doesn't mention the name of that place either. So I guess that doesn't work out either way. And they think, well, they never mentioned that Jesus lived in Nazareth. Well, Paul has wrote these letters some 10 to 15 to 20 years after these people had had the gospel preached to them. Don't you think that the idea Jesus was born in Nazareth, that's the time they would have heard about stuff like that? Not 20 years later when they're worried about stuff like, well, speaking in tongues, can we do that? That what relevance is Nazareth going to have to that? Absolutely none. There's no reason that Paul is going to bring up something like Jesus living in Nazareth unless someone has a question about it. And who's going to doubt that if that was what was taught from the first and they don't have any reason to disbelieve it? And particularly, as I point out in the book you're holding there, the world of the New Testament was what scholars call a high context society. And this means that to us, a lot of the things that they wrote or when they spoke to each other were highly elusive. They took a lot of knowledge for granted by each other. Whereas we in this modern Western world, we tend to want to hear a lot of details over and over again, even if we've already heard them 100,000 million times. We'd like to reiterate things. Now, not me personally. I hate that. I hate being a low context person. But high context societies take a lot for granted. And that's the sort of document that the epistles were. They took a lot of the knowledge that the people had about Jesus for granted because this was stuff that they'd heard about 20 years ago, 15 years ago. It didn't need to be repeated because there was no purpose to it. So yeah, that I go into great detail in the Shattering book you held up about the high context society and how that applies. But here, there's no reason to wonder if Jesus was a historical person for Paul. I mean, the Gospels fill in that because that's their purpose as biographies. And therefore, again, there's no reason to go all over the place to this. Maybe it was a Jewish version of what other cultures were doing at the time. No, that's just an excuse to explain away a problem that you made up in the first place because you don't know what a high context society is.
Yeah, we got a lot of problems here. I mean, and Paul in 1 Corinthians 11 talks about Jesus took bread on the night that he was betrayed and recounts essentially what is in Luke's gospel there. In fact, that's usually the passage that a lot of churches use when they take communion, is the 1 Corinthians 11, the Pauline rendition there.
Well, Earl Doherty says because it doesn't say Wonder Bread or name the brand of bread that Jesus used or the brand of peanut butter he smeared all over it, then Paul obviously didn't believe that this actually happened on earth and they actually had heavenly peanut butter and heavenly bread, which didn't have a brand name.
Right, and it is true that Carrier, when he came out, reviewed Doherty's work, and kind of dismissed parts of it to kind of, I think, prop himself up as if he was correcting Doherty. But it's clear he was building a lot of Doherty's work and ideas and whatnot. And even said at one time, I think in one of his reviews, that it was almost graduate level or is at that level or something like that, but not quite the PhD level. I forget exactly what he said. I remember reading all his reviews of all the Christ mythers because I understood what he was doing. He's trying to show his dominance in the field. But I mean, he gave Doherty some props and love. And this was the guy, kind of before Carrier, the whole Jesus puzzle, the God who wasn't there and all that kind of stuff. Now, this, for some of the audience, this is like old school apologetics, but we've kind of seen this come, and it's weird to see a Westminster grab the latest version of this and tell us, hey, bro, trust me on this. It's wild, and it's not just trust me. It's like, trust Richard Carrier. Don't forget, everyone, that the Apostle Paul spoke about James, the brother of Jesus. So how does Jesus have a brother if he's not? These guys try to make it as if that's not really what that means, though. JP, of course, But Paul did say things about a physical Jesus. I just named a few of them, but it's not true that he never wrote about earthly Jesus, even though that's not his primary intent in the way of, recounting history,
Exactly. They have an excuse for every single one of these. I don't know that we need to talk about all of them.
Right.
I mean, if anyone's feeling masochistic, they can pick up my book and see all the different ideas.
Yeah, it's like a game of dodgeball. They're just avoiding the evidence,
Exactly. I mean, even if you put a dodgeball in a cannon, they're going to find some way to curve their body around at a 90-degree angle, sort of like Plastic Man.
Well, let's read page 244 here again, and here's what Brady says. Could it be... Sometimes I feel like Brady feels like an argument is actually just asking a question, or just asking a question equals an argument or a point scored. A lot of the book is constructed like this. Could it be that Paul is simply adapting Judaism to the religious ideologies of Israel's latest oppressors? Just want to stop there. Yeah, because the Jews were all about that life. And that Jesus eventually became more historical when Gentile Christians in the Roman world envisioned and assigned gospels for the Savior at the center of their mystery cult. Just want to stop there. Brady basically is calling Christianity a first century Greco-Roman mystery cult, just Judaized. Did everyone catch that? This is what I'm saying. I love and respect Brady. He gets a lot of kudos from what he's done before, but here's where he is now. And he's kind of upset at me. In fact, his buddies were accusing me of being dishonest and stuff when they reviewed the reviews. But honestly, look at what he's really saying here, people. I'm reading from his book. Look at what Brady is saying here. I'm going to read this again, then JP, jump on this. Could it be that Paul is simply adapting Judaism to the religious ideologies of Israel's latest oppressors, and that Jesus eventually became more historical when Gentile Christians in the Roman world envisioned and assigned gospels for the Savior at the center of their mystery cult? Carrier argues that this would be similar to other Savior gods of that time who also gained historicity after their mythical origins. And by the way, Deacon Hakka, it's not historicity, it's historicity, Hakka. Just trying to help you out there, brother. It's historicity, not historicity. Okay, sorry, I'll back off the spice. JP, comments.
Boy, one of these could it be kind of things. I have no end of irritation for that kind of thing. There's no documentation presented here, no specifics for me to grab onto. But let's see. Tell you what I would want. Okay, so Carrier argues that this would be similar to other savior gods who also gained historicity, or whatever that is, after the mythical origins of Cain and Abel, Able.
Well, hold on. Let me you're sliding that in real quick. Let's go ahead and make it painful. What are you referring to when you just did that, JP? And the reason why I'm asking you to do that is because when Brady reviewed Apologist in Detroit's work on this, and one time Apologist in Detroit said Godwin instead of Goodwin, Brady jumped all over it. So let's go ahead and explain what you just did there. Please, real quick. Go ahead, brother.
Yeah, check the spelling of Cain and Abel in his book. He spells it Able, like it's some sort of home improvement kind of thing. Cain and Abel. But anyway.
Can I go to the bathroom? I don't know. Are you able?
Yeah,
like that.
I can't.
All right.
But anyway, so what I would want here, we said other savior gods who gained historicity. I would want Examples. I want some names, please. Now, I don't know if Carrier offers any, but he doesn't give a footnote there even for me to find out. But let's say Mithra, okay? I can't find anyone who thinks Mithra became a historical person. I can't find anyone who thinks Dionysus later became a historical person. I can't find anyone who thinks you know, any of these figures became historical people who were once in the heavens. Doherty, as I cannot recall a single example of him coming up with a person who was like that. Instead, what we see biographies of great teachers like Socrates, for example. There were several disciples of Socrates or followers of Socrates who wrote biographies of him. That's the sort of thing that we have as a parallel to Jesus. I don't see any parallel of anyone coming up with biographies of what were formerly gods who lived in the heavens. The closest you might get is someone like Apollonius of Tyana, but he was always considered to be someone on earth. He was never considered to be someone who lived in heaven.
Right, and that's an excellent point. What everyone on the audience, I want you to catch what JP is bringing out here. The whole assumption that even happened and now it's happening again is not even historically viable. That assumption that Carrie is assuming that Brady's going along with, that's not even real. Like that these guys, these myths gained historicity. So it's like the whole schema is bad assumption followed by bad assumption argued in bad faith when it comes to Carrier. Not saying so with Brady, but Brady, why would you trust Carrier here? My goodness. Continue on here with page 245. This skeptical view is just one of many attempts to make sense of the puzzling relationships. Let me just stop there. So he doesn't really give alternatives in very real ways here. He basically presents Carrier surrounded by parts of N.T. Wright in relationship to other issues of the New Testament. Then just says, well, that's one of many views, although he's talking about Carrier observing and noting things and pointing out things. So he's trying to have it both ways. He's playing a hardball, but then he's acting like he's playing softball. Nah, bro, we see what you're doing. We're reading the words on the page. Now he'll back up a little and act like it was a question, even though he's putting forth Carrier, historian Richard Carrier, and then says, well, that's just one of many attempts. Really, it's the New Testament's fault for being so crazy, in itself, basically. But let me read this. I just want everyone to see how subtle and sly and slick this is, frankly. This skeptical view is just one of many attempts to make sense of the puzzling relationships between the various perspectives of Jesus found in the New Testament. There are other views, some more and some less liberal. And then, of course, there is the conservative Christian view, which holds that everything communicated from Matthew to Revelation is actual and factual. The scriptures were breathed out by God, and the Holy Spirit brought back to the disciples' memory everything Jesus taught them. These memories were then faithfully transmitted to the writers of the Gospels. Conservatives taking this position ask the liberal and the skeptic, why would the Gospels writers do what you claim? Why would they write these things about Jesus if they were not 100% true? Answering this will occupy the remainder of this chapter. All right, JP, your turn.
Well, chocolate mixed with spaghetti meatballs loaded into a catapult and launched against the side of the wall. I mean, there's just nothing here for me to grab onto. There's no argument to speak of. There's a lot of just a vague story. I've just read, how many books I've read. I've read maybe tens of thousands since I began all this in 1998. I just don't see how anyone can be this bewildered or act this bewildered.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot of scholarship, and there's some tension in there, but there's a penumbra of acceptable thought, and within
penumbra. I'm supposed to be vocab, but I don't know what that word means. What's penumbra?
It's like like around a light source. It's like the halo around a light source.
Really?
You might say something like that.
Hold on. Let's have a little fun. Hey Google, define penumbra.
I think that I'm probably thinking back to some use of it from another person.
Penumbra is used as a noun to mean the partially shaded outer region of the shadow cast by an opaque object.
There we go.
Hear how penumbra...
Hey, okay, thank you, JP, coming through with the definitions with the fire. You get the applause button. Okay.
All right.
As you were saying, there's a penumbra
Yeah, okay. So anyway, yeah, there's a certain amount of acceptable thought in scholarship, and there's thought on the fringes. I don't know where he's locating himself. This is like a dartboard where he picked up 50 darts and just threw them at the dartboard, and they don't, and none of them actually land. So, there's nothing for me to grab onto here. I don't see any problems with any of these things he's talking about. I don't see the kind of depth of difficulty that he's worried about here. And if I may just say, then this seems to be very common in so many what I call former Christian books, shall we say?
Hmm.
It seems like they have swallowed a lot of stuff and tried to throw it all together like this spaghetti and chocolate meatballs, and then come up with some sort of crisis that they can't manage.
Right.
That's not the way to do study and scholarship. You do have to. There were I did reading on all manner of subjects, and I've changed my mind on a number of things over the years. But I didn't immediately give up when I saw, gee, there are problems with end times theories, and I didn't. That didn't cause me to immediately apostatize. I studied, and eventually I came up with a couple of years with a view that I was satisfied with, and I've done the same for other things that caused me problems. But seems like at the moment someone like this runs into a problem, they're pulling on the cord that gets the sirens going, and
Hmm.
asking the bus to stop so that they can get off. I think Lutheran Satire had a great video like this about a swim coach, someone a professional swimmer who was saying, "Well, I couldn't find all the answers, so I got out of the pool." And the coaches are in the pool saying, "We have all the answers. You haven't come to us for them." And that's what I feel like here. That's what I feel like has happened here, and in so many other books that are a dime a dozen by former Christians.
Yeah. Well, let's now go
Yes.
to divine birth, because this
Uh,
kind of relates. So we're not dealing with every single claim, even in this chapter, but we are jumping at some parts here. So here we go on the. This is page 249. By the time of Matthew's account, John the Baptist still has no backstory, but Jesus does. The Holy Spirit has done a divine work within the Virgin Mary, and a child is conceived in her womb. Now, I'm going to stop there, and I want you to notice how deceptive and manipulative this sentence is. He's setting it up as if you would know this if you were informed. It's a given if you're informed. You'll know what I'm saying to you. See, that's deceptive to me. It's manipulative. Watch what he says here. Informed readers will know that this story is not unique. So, by the way, if you don't know what he's saying, then guess what? It's because you're not informed, everyone. Brady says so. Richard Carrier says so. There are many myths about demigods being born to human women without sexual intercourse. Like we saw with the mythical elements in Genesis, the conservative Christian response is to identify what makes the virgin birth different when it appears in the Bible. But the differences do not erase the similarities. As historian Richard Carrier points out, hold on, we need to do something every time when we get as historian Richard Carrier points out, there is a common, powerful idea that inscribed each of the various renditions of this myth. This was a way to lionize a oh man, I'm messing up my own jokes here. This was a way to lionize a literal or literary hero as more than just a man. So he's kind of repeating something he said there before, but let's comment on it again to those just coming in. JP, divine birth, Richard Carrier.
Well,
What do you say?
we've already spoken about that, of course. I mean, the point is divine conception, not birth per se. There is nothing that matches that. Now, and this is a very typical game, though, of the copycat crowd. Of the Christ myth theory, which is they try and describe two very unlike things with the same general terminology in order to yell, well, there's a parallel. And I'll just give you an example of how I answer this kind of thing. Yeah, I long ago did an article in which I compared the assassinations of Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy. And I had this fake historian of the future decree that one story was obviously made up based on the other. And here's an example of how they did that, of how they drew parallels. So, on the one hand, Abraham Lincoln, when he went to the Ford Theater, had a special arrangement where he sat in a presidential box with a balcony seat. A partition had been removed to make way for his full party, and a rocking chair had been brought to him so that he could use that instead of the normal seat. At the same time, Kennedy rode in a vehicle called a Lincoln, manufactured by Ford. It was a custom vehicle, longer than most such models, and the rear seat had a special ability to rise 10.5 inches at the flick of a switch. It's a parallel because both Lincoln and Kennedy had special seating at their assassination. You see, it doesn't matter that the details are different. They're similar because they both had special seating arrangements. So one was obviously stolen from the other. And of course, the modern version of Kennedy, which was mythological, was adjusted for modern times. Rather than a rocking chair, he would have a car and seat, and so on and so forth. This is the kind of thing that's going on here when Brady does this. They simply generalize as much as they can the descriptions of the different stories in order to create a parallel that does not exist.
No doubt. That is what's going on in Carrier's work, which unfortunately, Brady seems to be relying upon heavily here. Now, let's skip forward a little bit here in chapter 11 of Let There Be Gaslight by Brady Goodwin Jr., the man on your screen on my right. I don't know what that is for you. Revisionist Prophecy Part 2. This is on the death and deity section where he talks about the Gospel of John. I want to read this out. I know we're skipping a little bit ahead, but this relates, I think, and you'll understand when you hear it. Listen to this, everyone. But then comes the Gospel of John, which most scholars agree was the last of the four to be written, much later, in fact, than the others. By the time John writes, the claims about Jesus have grown to epic proportions. This late gospel contains insights into Jesus' identity and the significance of his death that none of the synoptics are aware of. Notice, that's a charge. It's not that the synoptics don't include it, they're not aware of it. I want to again point out some of the slippery language that Brady employs here. Saying the synoptics are not aware of it, how would he know what they're aware of? It may be true they don't include some of those things. That may be true if he's factually reporting a part right, which he may be in relationship to the synoptics when you compare him to John. But it says they were not aware of. Just want to point that out. That's an assumption. Not aware of. Okay. Grown to epic proportions. John chapter 1, verse 1 begins with the recapitulation of Genesis 1, verse 1 in the beginning, where Jesus is now identified with and as God. John calls him the Logos. Decades before John, the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria had already employed that term, combining the Greek philosophical concept with Judaism's theology. Hold on, we'll get there. I'll let you do that just as soon as we're going to talk about a little bit about Platonism here. In Middle Platonic thought, the material world was considered to be too impure for the divine creator to have any direct contact with it. So they developed the concept of the Logos as an intermediary principle or force that God could use to physically create and govern the world while remaining transcendent and inaccessible. Philo incorporated this concept into Judaism, but sought to close the distance between the Logos and God. He did this by humanizing and practically deifying the Logos, calling it an archangel, a heavenly high priest responsible for giving sins, heavenly Adam, the firstborn of God's creation, the eldest son, eternally begotten, and a deuteros theos, second God, in whose image mankind was made and through whom all things held together. And his source for that is the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy and Wikipedia, Philo's view of God. That's the sources that he gives there, everybody. JP, Wikipedia. I know you were chomping at the bit. Go ahead, brother.
Wikipedia, the abomination that causes misinformation. So, yeah, the main thing that this hits me right here is it acts like the Philo, was like the pioneer in this. He wasn't. It seems this relates to an article I wrote about the figure of wisdom in Proverbs and throughout the Old Testament and in the intertestamental period. This whole idea of what's called a hypostatic entity long predated Philo, long predated any of the figures of the New Testament. And this is the figure of wisdom that John identified Jesus with, but so did Paul, and so did the other synoptic gospels, although their allusions to it are less obvious. So actually, all he's done here is show that he hasn't done his homework. And I find this especially strange because he actually cites a scholar within the book. Let me check and see how many times. Michael Heiser.
Yeah, he does quote Heiser. Yes, he does quote Heiser.
And this is, yes, many times Tiser's name is found at least 20 times in here, although a lot of that is probably in the index
Right.
or in the citations. But nevertheless, Heiser is one of the people who is a pioneer in this area, who's written a lot of work on the hypostatic entities. So, did he happen to miss those? I mean, if he has read them, he certainly doesn't show that he's read it in this section.
Yeah, what is it? Alan Siegel, Two Powers? What is that?
Two Powers is another. Yeah, Two Powers in Heaven is another related book that's very good about this issue. And I believe N.T. Wright has some material on it as well, though not as much in depth. Yeah, and I have a whole article on this subject.
And also, doesn't he miss the whole concept of Memra from the Targums?
That was related as well. Yeah, that was all. It was all of a piece. Philo was not alone, and he didn't come up with it for the first time. And the Greeks, yeah, they had their own idea about that, but it was a very common idea. Even the Assyrians had an idea like that. But it's just something that, in their view, in a philosophical sense, was very common sense. And I can see,
yeah. Some of this reeks of outdated theories. Some of this here, like for example, where you've got scholars sometimes used to say, you'll still hear it repeated though. John's gospel clearly Greek, perhaps even Gnostic in thought, not very Hebraic, not very Jewish. And then we see things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the sectarian sects found at Qumran, and you say, oh, there's this whole thing about sons of light and sons of darkness. This is something, this motif is common of that time. That's very Hebraic, obviously. We're talking about the Qumran community. And you see, John is employing that for different purposes. That's an example of that. And you're like, John's gospel is Hebraic and actually seems to be written contra Gnosticism, not some proto form of it or something like that. And it seems like Brady's like on some of that outdated stuff like that. That's stuff that's like, no, where are you?
He's been seed picking again.
Yeah. Well, let me read this next part about Philo here, and then we're going to move on to Paul and probably end around there. Back to Paul, because he goes back to Paul. Philo was no Christian. He was a Jew who wrote and died before Christianity spread. But his successful blend of Jewish religion and Greek philosophy, by the way, we don't necessarily discount that that's what Philo did a lot, by the way. I just want to make sure we're not disagreeing, or at least I wouldn't, from what I understand, was drawn upon heavily by the later authors of the New Testament, most notably perhaps in John's Gospel, where Jesus is introduced both as God and as having been with God, existing and functioning as the Logos and the only begotten Son. This is syncretism at its best. That's what Brady says about John's Gospel. Greeks can embrace Jesus because the Logos is not fully God. Jews can embrace him because the Creator is not distant from the act of creation, but is directly responsible for it. And Romans can embrace Jesus because, in true mythic form, he was not just with God in the beginning, he was God. Everybody wins!
I don't know. I don't see where he gets all this from. And again, he didn't blend Jewish religion and Greek philosophy. He was using an idea that was well known in that world, in that philosophical setting, long before, in the time of Proverbs, in the intertestamental period. It was known by the Egyptians. It was known by the Assyrians. They each had their own version of this hypostatic entity idea. And that is the reason, if he wants to find a reason why it was so easy to accept, that's more likely why it is, because this was a well-known concept to the Greeks, to the Jews, to all these people. There's no further explanation that's needed, even one as convoluted or as lacking in detail as the one he's giving here.
No doubt. Let me read this last section, get your response to it, and then let you go. And I, again, appreciate you coming on, JP Holding. Everyone, this is an OG of Christian apologetics. You need to check out his works. And everyone, hey, be sure to give this video a thumbs up. We've got 41 likes, only 2 dislikes. I think perhaps
Richard Carrier and Brady.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. See, Richard, they're watching this. And there you go. I like it. Paul to the Rescue, page 262 here, of Let There Be Gaslight by Brady Goodwin Jr. It might be tempting to think, wow, then how was Paul able to come up with all that great Jesus-based theology? What a miracle! But if all that great Jesus-based theology is different from what the Gospels say Jesus taught, and even the author of 2 Peter 3:15-16 could comment that some of Paul's writings are hard to understand, then what should we make of this? Paul was writing letters and planting churches 15 to 20 years before the first gospel was written. As others joined the field of compiling stories about the life and teachings of Jesus, none were able to recover any material that would corroborate the doctrine in Paul's revelations. This creates an odd symbiotic relationship between the gospels and the epistles. Without the gospels, we would not know anything about the earthly life of Jesus, whom Paul preaches. Notice, what an overstatement. Honestly, what a lie. Wouldn't know anything. You would know he stood before Pilate and Timothy. We get that. You would know that he had family. You would know that he was born under woman. You would know that he died. You know that he's crucified. What do you mean you wouldn't know anything? You would know what he did on the night before he was betrayed. You would know we have 12 disciples. What do you mean? And that's just from the top of the head. Wouldn't know anything? Brady, shame on you, frankly. Sorry, JP, that's not you. That's me. You don't have to take responsibility for that. But seriously, Paul hardly even seems to know much about him. Yet without Paul's input, would the writings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by themselves have been enough to sustain the church for the past 2,000 years? Would Christians have a message that the world truly needs? According to the four evangelists, that in Jesus, God became a man. Then he lists a bunch of stuff that, according to the evangelist, was done. And then I'm going to skip those because you can see those. It just kind of encapsulates it there. Do you see the problem with this gospel without Paul's input? There is nothing within it that specifies why Jesus had to die. Really? Nothing? Jesus said, I came to give my life as a ransom for many. He said, I lay down my life for the sheep. What do you mean? He says he drank the cup of wrath of God. What? Nothing in it that says why Jesus had to die? He says that's why he came. My goodness, when he was born, he'll save his people from their sins. Brady, what are you talking about here? Seriously. My goodness, sorry. Man. Nor why everyone in the world needs his saving service. Really? Even though Jesus says in John, if you're not born again, you can't see the kingdom of God. If you don't believe who I say I am, you're dead in your sin. What are you talking about, man? This is a little frustrating. I'm just going to say that, JP. For example, the synoptics tell of a... You know what? Let me... I'm going to finish after this here because I'm getting worked up. I haven't got worked up when I've done these reviews until now because this is so deceptive. It's infuriating. For example, the synoptics tell of a young rich ruler who thought he had flawlessly kept God's law his entire life. Jesus was able to pull the man's card by exposing his commitment to material things rather than to the maker of that material. But this neat party trick is not something the average Christian can do when she runs into an obstinate believer who thinks he has no need for the gospel. By the way, never mind, just let me stop there. The four evangelists struggle, but manage to give Jesus' death theological significance. Oh, okay. What a patronizing sentence. Yet none of them were able to give it universal significance. This is where Paul comes in. I'm just going to stop there again. John 12, if I be lifted up, I will draw all men unto me. Matthew 28, go therefore into all the world, make disciples of all nations. What do you mean, man? This is okay. I'm gonna stop there because I know I said about an hour. Brother, you're gonna get that final word and all that. You're a great guest and I love everything you've been doing. Break it down, and then I'm gonna play your video when you go off. I'm gonna play your video after you leave.
All right. Well, in addition to all we've said already about Paul having applied Jewish thinking that was already well known at the time, and everything else we've said about that, I'm going to add one other point here that ties the Gospels together with the epistles, and this is all in spite of the fact that they do have entirely different purposes. The Gospels as biographies, Paul's letters as specific problem-solving letters, and never the twain shall meet except under specific circumstances. The whole setup that Jesus has in his ministry is as what we in modern times we use the terms as a broker of the covenant, and in that time God would be considered a patron or a wealthy supporter, and the people who became members of Jesus' movement would be called clients in that as we use the terms. That's not the terms they used, obviously, but that's how we describe it. Jesus consistently portrays himself as a broker between man and God the Father. And that's the same thing that Paul does as well. That's how he sees Jesus as well. I can't go into a lot of detail.
One mediator between God and man, for example, he says.
that is one of the key verses that describes that, although I don't think today we fully understand the significance of that. I think that verse is far more important than we realize in describing how the relationship works. All these things tie it all together, and tie together what Paul presents about Jesus and all the doctrinal significance, and what the Gospels present about Jesus and his specific actions that acted out that significance. I don't see a single reference in Brady's work to clients, patrons, or any kind of relationship, which was a key to that world's understanding of how people interrelate with each other. And this is an area of study that I've especially gotten into in the last decade. And without it, I don't think we can have a full-orbed understanding that helps us defeat some of these crazy ideas that come out from people like this. This is one of the reasons why I can't trust someone like this. First thing I always do is turn to their bibliographies.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just that he has Carrier in there. It's that he has so little of anything else. And yet he wants to convince us that he's made a decision we should all listen to. No, I can't do that.
Amen. Agree 100%. You get the air horn there. Everyone check out Tectonics. You can find JP stuff on YouTube. And I am going to play his old school video. JC4 Runner, I think, is the YouTube channel. And,
it's on mine too, yeah. But
that's not you? Okay.
That's not me. But he was the one who actually filmed it. He was the cameraman.
Okay. What's yours is Tectonics?
Tecton TV is a YouTube channel.
Now I'm sorry. I don't know why I forgot. I remember that. Yeah. Tecton TV, everybody. You can. It's TEKTON TV, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah, I just recently put up my 1,000th video.
Oh, wow, man. Well, you've been doing this for a hot minute. And, one more time, shout out to JP. Got a few of his books here, Mormon Defenders, James Patrick Holding. That's a good one. This one is, I think, indispensable. You really have to get this one. This one is good as well. Defending the Resurrection. Kind of go together there. And he's got a number of others. So, JP, keep it up. Thanks for joining. And I'm glad that you are safe and in a good mood today.
Yeah, we better explain that. Of course, I live in Florida, and I live in Orlando. So I was like 140 miles from where Hurricane Ian made landfall. Now, by the time any hurricane gets to Orlando, it's pretty much worn out. So we didn't have a lot of serious problems here. But yeah, there are an awful lot of people who had some serious problems down there in Fort Myers. It's a very terrible situation, very much so.
No doubt. Well, thanks for joining, brother, and we're glad you're on top, not under the weather. I'm going to finish the show by reading a couple more quotes, then playing this. We'll connect later, my friend.
All right. Take care, and thanks for having me.
God bless. No doubt. Peace out.
Bye-bye.
Okay, everyone, we need to read a few more quotes here of this book here and end up with that. Let me show you these last two paragraphs here of chapter 11, which we covered today. Y'all ready? Okay, let's see here. Let me flip this around here. There we go. Okay. All right. Well, I guess JP's not here anymore, so we'll take that down. Okay. Those longing for honesty and integrity are faced with a question. So notice again how he sets stuff up. Manipulation. If you long for honesty, integrity, you'll agree with Brady, right? I mean, that's what he's saying. Those longing for honesty and integrity are faced with a question. What if all this time we have simply been perpetuating the origin stories and revisionist history of an ancient people who developed their own rich socio-religious traditions to psychologically meet the challenges they faced based on their limited understanding of human nature and nature in general? He basically saying, what if the Bible is a big coping mechanism and we've been thinking it was true, when in really it's just literary therapy? You guys see that? That's what's going on. And what if Paul and the gospel writers use those ancient myths to tell a New Testament story that the Old Testament does not recognize? He's saying they're incongruent there, OT and NT. In his handbook on the New Testament use of the Old Testament, G.K. Bill justifies why it is acceptable for Paul and the other authors to use the OT the way they did. By the way, I encourage you to get that book, not just the handbook, which is smaller, which is good enough, but the full big one called the commentary. Really good work. Now, I'm going to read the last paragraph of this. So this is where he goes after telling us to trust Richard Carrier. Watch where he goes now. I was at one time willing to trust such explanations because the NT authors, Paul in particular, did such a great job at answering what no one else had. Why do we sin and why do we die? They tied it all back to the same God who answered one of the other ultimate questions. What is our origin? But in light of what we now understand about human origins and about Paul's mishandling of Genesis and of Genesis mythologizing of the creation of earth and human history, if we cannot trust the Bible to give us truth regarding creation and the fall, then it behooves us to ask if there could possibly be another explanation for the quandary of sin and human suffering. One that does not necessitate redemption. Look at that. Another issue for which the Bible demands trust but has not earned it. But before we address this question, it will be helpful to unpack the terms truth and trust, especially as it relates to the practice of faith. And that's where he leads to the next chapter, which Adam Coleman and the brothers killed when they covered this chapter. Killed. So I think that's important. That gives you a good flavor, a good taste. JP did a great job. Again, one more time. You get the... All right, now I want to play this JP Holding video as we close this show out. I think you guys will appreciate this. Let me grab this. Where is it? Just give me a second here. I'm ready to go. Do you guys have any questions as we end this show, by the way? I hope you guys caught this. This is important because you run into atheists who basically will say the same type of thing, okay? So it's very important today. This is a 4-minute video, and I encourage you to watch it. Here we go.
And now it's time for Gods in the News. Here with today's report, your host, Warner Winkerton.
Good evening. Welcome to Gods in the News. I'm Warner Winkerton. It's election season again, and the gods are crowding in for the attention of all the masses who are looking for a savior and Lord. As a public service, this program is interviewing all the divine candidates. Today we have with us one of the, shall we say, more colorful of the group.
That's right, Warner. I'm Dionysus Divine. I'm the god of wine who's so handsome and fine. Woo!
Yes, Dionysus. Thank you. You've claimed in some of your literature to, and I quote, give the creeping heebie-jeebies to that Jesus cat. Would you mind explaining that for our audience?
Well, Warner, let me tell you something about that Jesus cat. All that stuff about him turning water into wine, being born of a virgin, being crucified, he got that from me, baby. Check this out. This here's a picture of my mama, Simile. She was a virgin when she had me, and you can take that to the bank, baby.
Yes. Well, I hate contradicting our guests, but according to my sources, Mr. Dionysus, the chief story of your origin says that your dear mother was impregnated by Zeus in the form of a lightning bolt. That's not exactly what I'd call virgin, sir.
Let me tell you another story, okay? You know the story of how Jesus turned water into wine, right? Ha! Who do you think gave him that idea in the first place? I'm the god of wine, Warner, baby, and nobody, I mean nobody, gets wine from water like Dionysus.
Well, I confess that your association with wine is a well-known fact, sir, and I do see that you have more than a passing acquaintance with it. However, according to the historians I have consulted, that story of you turning water into wine dates to a time after Jesus lived. Can you comment on that?
Oh, it does? Well, I got another story. Let me tell you about this one. Know who that is on the cross, Warner? Yeah, baby, that's me, the one and only. Dionysus hung on a cross for your sins, little man, and that's a fact.
I've seen that picture before, sir. I believe it's an artifact recognized by modern scholars to be a forgery. Well, it appears our guest has some thinking to do, as do we all, when it comes to marking the box on this year's ballot. We here at Gods in the News encourage you all to thoroughly check out all of the candidates and make a wise decision. Oh, I'm getting a signal now that our guest has something more to say. Yes, sir.
Well, Warner, I gotta say, you really laid down the law. Dionysus is going to be turned over a new leaf. From now on, Dionysus is no longer the god of wine. Instead, Dionysus is the god of energy and sports drinks. Woo!
Yes. Thank you. Well, that's all for this evening's Gods in the News. On behalf of the crew here, I'm Warren Winkerton. Good night.